Talking today about free will and determinism. So the question here is whether humans are genuinely free with regard to their actions. And one thing that really strongly bears on that question is whether determinism is true. Determinism we'll get more specific on in a minute, but it's the claim that your actions are determined by the sort of physical causes that have come before. So you might wonder, what's the importance, what's the relevance of this? So let's talk a little bit generally about that before we dive in, just to kind of motivate interest in the topic. So whether we're free seems, at least initially on first glance, to have a lot of relevance to lots of really practical matters. One of those is blameworthiness and accountability, right? So we typically blame people for things that they've done wrong. If someone trips your kid on the sidewalk or is rude to you in the store, you want to blame them. They've done something wrong. They should be held accountable for what they did. They're responsible for it, right? Maybe even they should be punished for it. Now, all of those things are, different concepts being applied, different properties. However, all of them seem to hold some sort of relationship to freedom. Because after all, if you went up to the person who tripped your kid on the sidewalk and they said, actually, there's a microchip in my brain and there's an evil scientist playing around with, a PlayStation controller and making me trip kids on the sidewalk, you wouldn't really blame them anymore. You wouldn't blame that person. In fact, you'd blame the scientist. But you wouldn't blame the person who did the tripping because they weren't really free to do it. So what it looks like is that to be able to blame someone, they have to have been free to have done the thing. Right? They could have done otherwise. If they couldn't have done otherwise, why are we talking about blaming them? They had no choice in the matter. Similarly, with responsibility and accountability, punishment is a little bit more complicated because we have different reasons that we punish people and different theories of the proper role of punishment, right? So on one theory of punishment, though, you're giving people what they deserve, right? They just deserve to be punished for what they did wrong. And on that theory, punishment also seems to hold a really tight connection with freedom, because someone doesn't deserve to be punished for something that they had no control over, right? Again, if you went to the person who tripped your kid on the sidewalk and it said, gave you the computer chip story, if punishment is all about giving someone what they deserve, you probably shouldn't punish that person. They don't deserve to be punished because they had no freedom. However, on other theories of punishment is about deterrence or reform of the individual. And on either of those sorts of theories, deterrence just being keeping the person from doing bad things again, and reform being making them, sort of a better person. And, those things might kind of go together in most cases, might come apart in some cases. I don't know if you can deter someone without making them a better person. At any rate, you could do both of those things even if the person is not free. So if that's your theory of the proper role of punishment, then maybe it doesn't matter to you whether we're free. We can still punish because punishment has deterrent effects even if we're not free, right? Even if we're just little machines that operate according to a procedure, part of that procedure could be I'm going to act differently when I face a certain consequence. Okay, however, this is all just to say that whether we're free does seem to have deep practical importance for our everyday normal lives. And so this is not a merely academic endeavor here trying to figure out whether we're free. But let's get down into the details. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, so we talked about determinism. Here's a fuller definition. Given the complete state of the physical universe at any time, pick any time, and the laws of physics, so the laws governing how that physical state changes into a different physical state, there's only one set of events that can occur. That is the claim of determinism. Here's a different way of getting at it, if that's a little jargony for you. Imagine, this is Laplace's demon. Laplace, a couple hundred years ago, proposed this thought experiment to sort of get at the idea of determinism. He said, suppose there was a demon, or some kind of being, some kind of super smart being, who could know everything, the position and properties of every single atom, or if you don't, whatever, the fundamental particles, the position and properties of every single fundamental particle in the universe, and knew all of the physical laws that governed their movement and interaction. If that demon had both of those pieces of knowledge, that demon would be able to predict with 100% accuracy everything that happens in the future, ever. That's the claim of determinism. Okay, so the physical state of the universe is how the universe is at any given time, and then the physical law, or the laws of physics, are what governs how that state changes into other states, right? How this pencil goes from being in the air to being on the table, right? There's a state, that is the pencil being here, and there's another state a millisecond later, and there's some laws that govern how it goes from this state to this state, right? So if you knew all of the states of every single thing, including, these little microphone socks or whatever they're called, the pencils, the mugs, the earth itself, the planets, et cetera, how all the details about every single object and state of the universe, and you knew all of the laws about how they interact and change and move, then you'd know everything about the future of the universe, including how humans will act. That's the really important part for today. Now, there's a little bit of a wrinkle here. The wrinkle is that this is how we formulated the thesis of physical determinism on an older model of physics. Now, let me just state a sort of disclaimer here. I am not a scientist, and I have a very public school level of understanding of science. So I'm going to try to give you my broad brush understanding of where things stand, but I'm going to try to stay super general because I don't know the details of how, for example, quantum mechanics works. But we, before the modern sort of day of physics, we had a sort of mechanistic understanding of the universe, or a deterministic understanding of the physical universe, at least. That, roughly speaking, for any given particle or physical object, if you knew its current state and you knew all the physical laws, you could say what it's going to do in the future. That's roughly the thesis of determinism. However, with the onset of quantum physics, related things, we have what's called the principle of uncertainty, or what's also called Heisenberg's principle of certainty. This is Werner Heisenberg on the left. If you have seen Breaking Bad, you know the reference I'm making on the right. The main character of Breaking Bad, his alias is Heisenberg. He's making a reference actually to Werner Heisenberg on the left. And on the right, you have the sketch that someone made of Walter White, who calls himself Heisenberg. The principle of uncertainty, again, I'm going to butcher this for people who actually know anything about physics, but the idea is just that there's uncertainty at the level of the fundamental particles. So you can't fully predict all of their future properties just knowing their current properties, or you can't fully predict what they're going to do or where they're going to be in the future based on where they are now, even if you know everything about what's going on with them now. And that's interesting because that's at the micro level, at the level of the fundamental particles. And yet people generally think that that sort of averages out at the macro level, at the level of things as big as, a coffee mug. The coffee mug is not going to do something unpredictable, but like disappear and appear over here. If I had fancy editing software right now, I would make it actually happen just to screw with you. But it's not going to happen at the macro level because statistically there's so many fundamental particles in here. Each given fundamental particle could be doing something kind of random, and yet statistically it's all kind of balance out, so to speak, so that at the macro level things are predictable. That's my super layperson public school level understanding of what's going on here. So this is a problem because determinists want to say that behavior is determined by the prior physical state of the universe and the physical laws, and it's not strictly speaking true, because at the fundamental level there's indeterminacy. You can't fully predict what's going to happen, even if you know everything about those fundamental particles. Okay, so is the whole enterprise talking about free will and determinism bankrupt because determinism isn't true? So what the positions we're going to talk about are some people think determinism is true and that means free will can't exist, or some people think determinism is true but they understand free will in a different way so that determinism and free will could both obtain. But if determinism isn't true, then why are we even talking about it? Well, we could still have possibly some level of determinism at the macro level. I'm not so sure about that, right? But things are still going to be predictable, incredibly predictable, maybe 100% predictable at the macro level, even at the micro level, even though at the micro level things are indeterminate and there's unpredictability. That's one reason we should maybe continue to worry about determinism. Another reason we continue to worry about determinism is because there are non-physical versions of determinism. So consider theological determinism. So determinism is just the idea that given some prior state of affairs, there's only one future state of affairs that could have obtained. And what we're really considering is not determinism per se, it's kind of physical determinism. Given the physical state of affairs and the physical laws, those things determine what's going to happen in the future. But consider a different kind of determinism, theological determinism. Lots of theists are worried that God sort of foreordained things in the past. So given God's will, not the physical laws and the physical state of the universe, but given God's will and what he decides to do, everything after that point could be determined. So there's no other way things could have gone. Or maybe it's because of God's foreknowledge. Since he knows everything, if he knows it's going to happen ahead of time, it's going to happen regardless of anybody's choice in the matter. So it's still worth talking about, because not only because you could have predictability or maybe even determinism at the macro level, physically speaking, but also there's non-physical kinds of determinism that we ought to be, or at least that could be interesting to talk about. So let's continue on. Okay, so here's a big distinction amongst determinists. You could imagine imagine coming to believe that determinism is true. It's not necessarily true, some will say, that we don't have free will. Just because there's only one way things could have happened, given the prior states of affairs and the physical laws, doesn't mean we're not free. Or so the soft determinists say. So the disagreement between the hard determinists and the soft determinists is a disagreement about the compatibility of two theses, or two claims. The hard determinists think determinism and free will are incompatible. If determinism is true, you can't have free will. And they think determinism is true, and so there is no free will. The soft determinists also think that determinism is true. But where they disagree with the hard determinists is they think that determinism is compatible with free will. So you can have determinism being true and free will could still exist. That's the disagreement. So you might wonder, how can you maintain free will even in the face of determinism? I mean, we just admitted I couldn't have done otherwise if determinism is true. If determinism is true, then when I drop the pencil, there's no way I could have not dropped the pencil given the prior state of affairs in the universe. So how could I be free? I couldn't have done otherwise. Well, what the soft determinist says is, well, look, everything you just said assumes one understanding of free will. You're assuming that in order to act freely, it has to be that you could have done otherwise. That's called the principle of alternative possibilities. In order to freely do something, you could have not done it. That's the principle of alternative possibilities. But they say that might not be true. Consider consider two cases, for example. So consider a killing, a murder. In one case, the person who pulls the trigger pulls it because they want to kill the person in front of them. Maybe it's even premeditated. And they've thought really hard about it, and they decided they really want to kill this person. They endorse their own desire to do this. They have no qualms, right? Now compare that to another case where someone is somehow being extorted to pull the trigger, or let's just consider a kind of hokey case where someone's finger is actually being forced to pull the trigger by someone else. So someone else is making that finger pull the trigger somehow. Maybe they've, if you want to get sci-fi, you can get sci-fi. There's a computer chip in their head that the person is fiddling with, just like in the sidewalk case. Somehow or another, the person is actually acting against their desires. They don't want to, they didn't decide to, but someone is making them pull that trigger and kill the person. Okay, what the soft determinist says is there seems to be a difference in these two cases, and it's not just that in the first case, the person could have done otherwise. The first case, the person is freely committing the murder because they're acting on a desire they have, and it's a desire they kind of endorse, and no one is externally, no one from the outside is making them do the thing. But notice, I didn't say anything just then about them being able to do otherwise, right? Maybe, imagine this scenario. This is going to be a kind of crazy scenario, but imagine the first case. The person kills the person. They commit the murder because they wanted to. They endorse the desire. It's premeditated. Nobody's forcing them to do it. Now, add in that if they had decided in that moment not to kill the person, there was actually a chip in their brain too. And if they had started to want to not to kill the person, the evil scientist would have activated the chip and forced them to kill the person. Okay, so let me restate that example again because it's getting complicated. This is the first case where the person actually premeditates the murder, kills the person based on their own desire to kill the person. No one's forcing them to do it. That's what actually happens. But it's also true that there's a little chip in their brain. Now the chip, as it actually happens, because they killed the person, does nothing. But it's a conditional chip. It switches on only if it determines, or only if the scientist determines that they're starting to change their mind and deciding not to kill the person. And in that case, if the chip detects that desire or that change of mind, it turns on and it forces the killer to commit the murder. Okay, so that's the case. Now, in that case, could the person have done otherwise? Could they have not killed the person? Could they have not have committed the murder? The answer is no. They don't know it. Let's say they don't know it. They don't know that the chip is there, but they couldn't have not done it. They couldn't have decided not to commit the murder because the chip would have turned on and forced them to commit the murder. And yet when they do it, they're still acting on their own desire. It's still a desire they endorse. They premeditated it. Nobody's forcing them to commit the murder in this case. And so it still seems like that's a very different case from the case where the person never wanted to do it and someone forced them to pull the trigger. The difference between these cases, the soft determinist is going to say, is that the person in the first case is acting on their desire. And so they seem to be free, even though they couldn't have done otherwise. And so this opens up space for the soft determinist to say, freedom is not a matter of being able to do otherwise. In that case I gave you where the chip, is a conditional chip, that person seemed free when they committed the murder. They freely committed that murder. They wanted to, they thought about it, they planned it out. Nobody was forcing them. Nobody was even influencing them. They came to it on their own volition, and then they killed the person. Looks like they freely did it, but they couldn't have done otherwise. So we need a notion of freedom, acting freely, that doesn't depend on the possibility of having acted otherwise. And this is their account, soft determinist account of what freedom is. To freely do something, let's call it X, just to throw a variable in there. Xing must be a result of your desire to do that thing. You must do that thing because you want it to. Nobody's externally constraining you. And finally, it's a desire that you actually want to have. It's a desire somehow that you endorse. So this is called a second order desire, a desire that you have a desire to have a desire, right? Now, if that sounds weird, let's take a sidebar for a second. Consider we all have cases of things we want, but we want to not want, right? Imagine trying to quit smoking. You want the cigarette. You want to not want the cigarette. Those are both compatible, right? You want it, but you want to not want it. So imagine trying to quit anything you're addicted to. It's going to be the case, right? So, but the third condition on the soft determinist account of freedom is that you actually want to have the desire that you're acting on, as well as acting on that desire, right? It's a separate condition from the first condition. So if you fit those three things, you're acting freely. And they say, but none of those three things requires that you could have done otherwise. So we have an account of free will that's actually compatible with determinism. Everything is determined by the prior physical state of the universe and the laws of physics, maybe, but we're still free. That's the soft determinist position. Okay, so that's hard determinism, soft determinism. What have we missed out on? Well, both of those positions accept determinism. What if you accepted that determinism and free will were incompatible, but you wanted to hold that free will still existed? Well, you'd end up with what's called libertarianism. So they agree with the hard determinist that determinism and free will are incompatible. You can't have both at the same time. If determinism is true, there's no free will. If free will is true, there's no determinism. But they disagree with the determinist because they think if you have to choose between determinism and free will, the hard determinist picks determinism, but the libertarian picks free will. And the libertarian says, I believe in free will, and I believe that's incompatible with determinism, so I think determinism is false. I think if Laplace's demon existed and knew all the prior physical states of the universe and all the physical laws, he still wouldn't be able to predict human behavior because humans are free. So determinism is false. You cannot get an accurate prediction of future events just by looking at the current state of the universe and the physical laws, because there's human freedom in the world. Okay, so that's libertarianism. So we have three big positions here, right? The libertarians and the hard determinists actually agree that determinism and free will are incompatible. They just disagree about whether determinism is true. The hard determinists and the soft determinists actually agree on the fact that determinism is true, but they just disagree on whether that's compatible with free will or not. Okay, so that's the debate as we have it.